The Earthscan Reader on NGO Management, edited by Michael Edwards and Alan Fowler. Introduction: Changing Challenges for NGO Management. Michael Edwards and Alan Fowler. Background and overview. In 1992, when the earliest contribution in this book was published, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and NGO management were scarcely a topic of public debate. To be sure, the beginnings of a literature on NGO and development already existed, and the humanitarian emergencies that hit Africa so hard during the 1980s brought some NGOs to worldwide attention. For the most part, however, NGOs were a marginal force in the world affairs, and although their leaders confronted new and complex management challenges on a daily basis, there was little by the way of advice or analysis to support them. 10 years later, the scene has changed completely. NGOs have moved from ladles in the global soup kitchen to a force for transformation in global politics and economics. This shift has been buoyed up by the democratic openings of the post-Cold War world, the popularity of non-state actors with donors, and the rising discontent with conventional politics. They now disperse between US $12 billion to US $15 billion per annum 2000, and their numbers and size have grown dramatically to over 1 million in India, for example, 200,000, 10,000 in Brazil, 1999, and at least 35,000 working internationally, 2000. The NGO literature has exploded, and with it has come an increasing body of knowledge and expertise devoted to the distinctive tasks and challenges that face NGO managers. This knowledge, however, is widely dispersed across books, journals, articles, and agency publications so that anyone who is interested in finding advice will have to search long and hard to locate it, something that busy NGO staff rarely have the time to do. In this book, therefore, we have brought together a range of key readings in the NGO management literature and organized them according to major challenges that NGO face in their work. Undoubtedly, these challenges have become larger and more complicated as a result of the changing global context. Globalization generates shifting patterns of poverty and insecurity within and between countries that call for more sophisticated strategies and interventions, increasingly connected across the boundaries of geography, sector, cause, and effect. The basis of the international system is shifting from subsidized resource transfers, that is foreign aid, to rules-based cooperation, with the real value of aid from the North falling by 21% between 1991 and 1998. Although high levels of funding through NGOs persist, 2000, NGOs have important roles to play in dispersing the aid that remains, but more broadly in helping to ensure that new global rules for trade, human movement, finance, and environmental governance are both fair and effective in combating injustice. Interstate conflict has replaced war between nations, with NGOs not just the prime provider of relief, humanitarian assistance, and specialized services, but increasingly acting as mediators between civilians, governments, and the military in complex political emergencies. Overall, the focus of NGO activity has expanded and shifted from the development as delivery to development as leverage, building outwards from concrete innovations at the grassroots level to connect with the structural forces that influence patterns of poverty, prejudice, and violence. Exclusionary economics, discriminatory politics, selfish and violent personal behavior, and the capture of knowledge and ideas by elites. Edwards, Hume, and Wallace, 1999, Fowler, 2000. These changes have significant implications for NGO roles, relationships, capacities, and accountabilities, and therefore pose new dilemmas for managers and other staff. Clearly, NGO operate in so many contexts at so many levels that generalization is hazardous. Some are oriented primarily towards advocacy and others towards operational work on the ground, with philosophies that range from warfare to empowerment, and from the political organizing principles of civil society to the economic principles of the market. Some are specialized providers of relief and humanitarian assistance, while others combine such work with broad-based development activities. Most NGOs are intermediaries in the sense that they work between the grassroots or community level and other levels and sectors of society, such as governments, the general public, businesses, and other institutions of the market, providing a range of support services that connects these different institutions with each other and with groups that are poor or socially excluded. Membership-based groups are rare in the world of international development, whose modus operandi has been the provision of foreign aid, although in other areas like human rights and the environment they are more common. Friends of the Earth, for example, or Amnesty International, and there are many other potential fault lines and sources of difference within the development NGO community, north and south, large and small, local and global, and those who accept government funding and those who don't. Increasingly, NGOs are combining elements of these different roles, functions, and levels of action in order to achieve their goals. This creates a particular set of management challenges that many chapters in this book addresses. This reader focuses on a subset of NGO that we call non-governmental development organizations, or NGOs. These organizations, which are intermediaries, work primarily on issues of poverty and injustice within developing countries and at the global level, form the majority of the group that have grown so dramatically over the last 10 years. We have chosen not to include the specific management challenges faced by humanitarian assistance NGOs or NGOs doing anti-poverty and social justice work in Europe and North America, because these groups face different contexts and specific dilemmas that deserve attention in and of themselves. However, we are confident that this chapter in this volume will be of general use to all NGOs, wherever they work. Despite the diversity that characterizes even the subsector of the NGO universe, NGOs do face a common core of challenges for management and organizational development around which this book is organized. We employ a definition of management that is broader than mere techniques of decision making, finance, and human resources. Effective management requires the articulation of a clear and common vision for the organization and a set of strategies to achieve it, the mobilization of all the necessary human, financial, and intellectual resources, and external contacts and connections that are required to operate these strategies effectively, and the continuous readjustment of strategy and structure in changing contexts, implying an intimate relationship between organizational processes and a dynamic internal and external environment. Organizational development implies a conscious process of acquiring and strengthening the characteristics required by an NGO to position itself for maximum impact and effectiveness. Hence, the reader opens with general sections on vision, roles, and strategy, and then progresses through the management dilemmas that face NGOs as they grow and change. The dilemmas of governance and accountability, participation and partnership, measuring achievements, organizational learning, resource mobilization, and sustainability, gender equity, and human resources. Constraints of space mean that we have to exclude many excellent contributions, but the collection that remains contains a cross-section of the best work published in these themes in the last 10 years. They capture and reflect the particular characteristics of NGOs, a distinct type of organization that are discussed below. The distinctive nature of NGO management and organizational development. At the most general level, all organizations have to deal with the same basic issues. For example, they all have to set a direction or identify goals, mobilize resources for what they do, and find ways of getting employees to behave in ways that are consistent with the goals that have been chosen. On its own, this generic level of analysis is not particularly useful. A more detailed understanding is needed. Consequently, management thinking and analysis disaggregate and focus attention on different organizational types in order to determine and compare how they behave and why. A common first disaggregation is between public administration, the government, and private for-profit businesses, and non-government organizations, NGOs, crudely distinguished as the first, second, and third sectors. As a subset of nonprofit organizations, NGOs deal with a particular mix of factors that distinguishes them from other NGOs and from governments and their businesses. As a result, they face a distinct set of management tasks and approaches to organizational change, distinctions that call for caution when applying lessons learned elsewhere. This warning applies even more strongly when diverse cultural settings and national contexts come into play. What then is the typical mix of factors that NGO managers must deal with, and how do they compare with management challenges in other types of organizations? First, although like governments, they deal with issues in the public domain such as poverty, injustice, exclusion, or degradation of the natural world, NGOs have no statutory authority to act. Their calling is voluntary and self-chosen, so NGOs must continually justify their presence in and value to society. Second, NGOs' power and influence is based on civic engagement, social mobilization, and reliance on social capital, not the political mandate and strong arm of governments or the financial capital and influence of businesses. The quality of NGO engagement with citizens is therefore a key determinant of organizational legitimacy and effectiveness. In terms of their activities, NGOs have organizational and wider development goals whose achievement relies on forces beyond their control in the constituencies they work for or try to influence at home and abroad. Consequently, organizational outputs are no real guide to achievement. A manager must look further to external impact across and in concert with an array of actors with no clear cut bottom lines of profit and loss or electoral success to rely on. Instead, NGOs must reconstruct their performance measures continually from a variety of claimants or users. As for many other nonprofit organizations, a third distinctive quality of NGOs derives from their position as intermediaries, wherein the resources required for their work do not come from those who they serve, either as taxpayers or customers. NGOs sit between and must negotiate with resource providers and the populations that justify their existence. For the organizations of concern to us in this book, this position ties them more or less directly to the policies, priorities, fashions, and procedures of official aid and to the political economy of foreign relations of the donor countries that drive and direct the aid system. In other words, aid usually exerts an influence on an NGO's direction and identity that is allied to international relations, forces, and interests. In addition, NGOs often work in conditions of instability, conflict, poor infrastructure, and poverty. Their constituencies reflect the lower, if not the lowest, strata of society economically, politically, and culturally. They have too little purchasing power to be of interest to businesses, but many constitute a potentially destabilizing force of concern to governments, leading to distrust of NGOs as allies to the poor. Depending on the politics of a country, the combination of foreign aid and alliances with poor can lead the ruling regime to place NGOs in the opposition camp, leading to open or covert constraints to their work or even on their existence. Unlike businesses that can exist to make money, NGO agendas are more likely to invite official suspicion and control. It cannot be assumed that ruling regimes and those that contend for political power perceive an NGO as neutral. Finally, in keeping with other nonprofit organizations, NGO cannot rely on hierarchy and coercion or financial rewards and material incentives as the means to obtain the compliance of staff towards organizational goals. Rather, the route to compliance lies in satisfying the self-motivation of staff and volunteers. In other words, responding to the personal value base that persuades an individual to work in and for the third sector. This values demand also applies to the process of organizational change. If the NGO is to be true to its calling, change must be negotiated and not simply imposed. So, from an NGO leader or manager's perspective, what does this combination of factors mean? Typically, it implies that, number one, the processes of external engagement and the constituency ownership of development are more often than tangible outputs or direct products of organizational action. Number two, organizational boundaries are essentially indeterminate. While control may stop at the organization's formal limits, a manager's span of influence must reach beyond. Number three, performance is a dynamic, organization-specific, complex, and socially constructed parameter that embraces contending interpretations depending on who's passing judgment and what power they possess. Number four, values count. Managers must create and sustain conditions that allow adequate values achievement among staff and volunteers, both day to day and especially when organizational change is required. Number five, NGOs are political, irrespective of what they may try to say or do, demanding political awareness and sensitivity in decision making. Number six, civic legitimacy and public trust must be continually invested in and worked for. Good intentions are not enough. Number seven, resources have a steering effect that must be factored into issues of organizational identity, civic position, and rootedness. Challenges for NGO management and organizational development. The distinctive nature of NGO management and organizational development set out above creates a particular set of challenges. Six are especially important. The first three relate to the fact that NGOs are or would claim to be values based organizations, a characteristic that complicates the nature of goals, incentives, and management structures in a number of important ways. The second three challenges relate to the complexity and uncertainty of the environment in which NGOs tend to operate, calling for approaches that recognize and respond to the need of manage multiple relations, shifting combinations of roles and funding sources, and new connections across old or unfamiliar boundaries. Social change as a goal. NGOs see social change as the ultimate goal of their activities, defined very broadly to mean a world without poverty, violence, injustice, and discrimination. At root, social change is a question of values, and values pose a constant dilemma for NGOs who want to link their mission with their management style and organizational development. What is the connection between social change the NGO outside the NGO and social change inside? Can the organization be an effective catalyst for social change unless it practices what it preaches in terms of participation, democracy, non discrimination, and empowerment? On the other hand, can the organization be effective at all unless it imposes a set of management structures and decision making processes that cut across these values? All NGOs face tension between these developmental and institutional imperatives when choices must be made about strategy and structure, partnership and accountability, funding and human resources. Much of the art of NGO management lies in reconciling, or at least accommodating, these competing perspectives. In addition, below this level of generality, there are many different and conflicts of opinion about how best to achieve the goal of social change, and all NGOs must struggle with the extreme complexity and high value laden nature of the processes that underlie the problems they seek to address. Of course, all institutions face complexity. Businesses must produce goods and services that make a profit in the marketplace, and governments must perform and communicate sufficiently well to be elected, but NGOs must achieve elements of both these sets of goals: efficiency, effectiveness, and public support, and use them to transform the worlds of economics, politics, and social relationships through the prism of different sets of values. This is a much more difficult task. The first two parts of this reader provide general guidance on how NGOs can tailor their roles and strategies to value base that motivates them. The nature of incentives. As a result of their values base and missions for social change, staff in NGOs are unlikely to respond effectively to conventional command and control management hierarchies or incentives based solely on material rewards. Of course, these things are not irrelevant. Even a modest increase can be significant at low levels of salary paid in most NGOs, but in general, personal commitment and satisfaction, a shared ideology, and a feeling that staff have meaningful stake in mission and direction of the organization are more important incentives to performance. This means that managers and NGOs may have fewer levels for influence than in business or government, or at least that the levers are more difficult and complex to operate. Staff must be brought into processes of organizational change and decision making on a less hierarchical basis, and change may have to be slower and more incremental in order to secure the necessary internal base of support. Changing or moving the boxes on the NGO's organgram is a popular option for managers in this sector as in others, but it is really effective without much deeper changes in culture and attitudes that rely on support from staff. Part 10 provides important advice on how to approach the issues of human resources and leaders from values-based perspective. Participation and empowerment. An internal commitment to values-based management complicates traditional structures and processes in any organization, but most of all in NGOs, since concepts of participation and empowerment lie at the heart of the paradigm they promote for social change. In theory, at least, NGOs must pay even more explicit attention to diversity, gender equity, and other issues of difference, the empowerment of staff so that they can live and work to their full potential, and participatory processes that allow everyone to say in matters that affect them. But these innovations must be organized and managed with great care, lest they overly impede decision making, creating participation paralysis, and introducing tensions that impede responsiveness, flexibility, and impact. As intermediaries, especially those based in the North, NGOs face the added complication that values must be reflected in external relationships if legitimacy is to be maintained, a problem that has led to much debate about the theory and practice of partnership. Unfortunately, the changing global context opens up a world of possibilities for NGOs to relate to each other through alliances between equals and networks based on synergy, not competition, replacing the symmetries of power and voice that have characterized North South relationships for so many years. Information technology helps this process along by enabling less hierarchical modes of organization and communication, advantages already well exploited by the business community but not yet by many NGOs. Peter Senge, 1998, argues that the most successful organization of the 21st century will look more like democratic societies than conventional corporations. Rather than trying to impose order on a chaotic world and complicating matters even further in the process, they will try to generate order out of chaos through non-authoritarian relationships between groups who are genuinely interested in helping one another develop new learning and capacities. Jonathan Coder likens this model to a smaller mothership with many more satellites and fewer organizational boundaries. In respect of non-authoritarian modes of management and operating processes with porous boundaries, NGOs may have already be ahead of many for-profit organizations. Part 5 and Part 9, Organizing for Good Development Practice and Dealing with Gender, contain a range of chapters that shed light on these difficult issues. Multiple accountabilities and shifting relationships. The fact that NGOs locate their work in the space that exists between communities and institutions of different kinds complicates the management of legitimacy, accountability, and other external relationships. NGOs must demonstrate accountability to a wide range of stakeholder groups who may have different information needs, priorities for the organization, visions of success, and definitions of legitimacy, including their board of trustees, their donors, individual and institutional partners, staff, and external critics. As noted above, unlike governments, which must face elections, and businesses, which must face their shareholders, NGOs have no single bottom line to measure their performance, and they work in situations where arbitration and causality are much more complex and dynamic. Attribution and causality are much more complex and dynamic. The changing global environment also challenges NGOs to develop ways of working that are less focused on promoting their own profile and more concerned with building alliances, working with others, and dividing up roles and responsibilities in a collaborative way. More openness to new ideas and greater willingness to learn are essential in context of new problems and new actors. Fast-moving and unpredictable change, the entry of corporations, churches, and trade unions into the development debates, and the increasing sophistication of information technology. Learning is the key to a more sophisticated understanding of the changing context for development work, the implications of these changes for NGO practice, and the ability of managers to select the most effective alliances and strategies to reach their goals on a continuous basis. Innovations in markets and economics demand much greater detail from NGOs in their analysis and proposals, without losing power of grassroots testimony and straightforward protest. Finally, nuanced judgment in complex political emergencies require more highly developed information gathering and analytical skills. Yet learning continues to be something of a holy grail for NGOs, and their staff. And parts 4, 6, and 7 look in turn at governance and accountability, how to measure performance and systems for organizational learning. Diverse and unpredictable funding sources. Despite the relative decline of foreign aid, NGOs are still favored by the donor community, and in low-income economies, local funds are usually hard to find. As a result, many continue to be funded from public than private sources, something that may compromise developmental imperatives by shifting accountability upwards, reorienting roles to areas prioritized by donors, and inducing a creeping sense of self-censorship. Sources of funds are also volatile, vulnerable to donor fatigue, and among general public, shifts in fashion and relationships between governments and international agencies, and the quirks and personalities of corporate philanthropy. Inevitably, therefore, many of the management challenges faced by NGOs revolve around funding and financial sustainability and how to preserve identity and continuity in core programs when income is difficult to predict from one year to the next. keeping overheads low while preserving quality, managing phases of expansion and retention to take advantage of fundraising opportunities without overexposing the organization, and forging a team composed of permanent staff, short term assignments, and consultants are all familiar dilemmas for NGO managers. In selecting from fundraising options, a critical challenge for managers is how to avoid funding sources or modalities that lead to mission creep, compromises values, and lead to co optation. Another is the need to distinguish between the size and profile of an individual NGO and structural reform or systemic change in indicators of success. This is important not only because structural reform is a key role for NGOs in the 21st century, but also because it reduces managerial anxiety about the size of the organization relative to others, a problem that takes energy and commitment away from more important tasks. What will make a difference to global poverty in the years to come will not be the number of villages that are served or children that are sponsored, but how grassroots actions is connected to markets and policies at multiple levels of the world system. A collective task in which the ability of NGOs to work together, not individual competitiveness, will be critical. Part 3 and 8 provide advice on the management of growth and the perennial issue of sustainability. NGO as connectors. In many ways, connectivity is the theme that ties all these management challenges together. As we noted earlier in the introduction, NGOs belong in civil society, but they are not solely of civil society because they purposefully work in the spaces between civil society, state, and the market. They may have particular geographical focus, but recognize that social change requires increasingly integrated action at the local, national, and global levels. To be effective, NGO campaigns need to be build broad-based constituencies for implementation as well as policy change among governments and international agencies. So they must develop strong links with the media and with the public, churches, labor unions, and NGOs and other movements. Stronger organizational learning requires an active partnership with universities and think tanks, consultants, and researchers. In sum, NGOs constitute a crucial part of the connective tissue of a vigorous civil society, so making and sustaining the right connection lies in the heart of effective NGO management. The strength of NGO lies in their ability to act as bridges, facilitators, brokers, and translators, linking together the institution, interventions, capacities, and level of action that are required to lever broader structural changes from discrete or small-scale actions. For managers, this is an immensely challenging task because it requires a degree of human and organizational flexibility and responsiveness that is difficult to achieve even in predictable environments, conditions of financial stability, and agencies of small to medium scale. Since none of these conditions apply to NGOs, their task is even harder. Vale's image of the white water raft comes immediately to mind, constantly moving between the rocks and currents of the river, reshaping itself to fit the contours of context and crew, and the light enough to survive even the most dangerous of rapids. The mirror image of the white water raft is the aging supertanker, an analogy that will not be lost on managers in large foreign aid dependent NGOs. These challenges require managerial skills of the highest order, tailored specifically to the context and values of the NGO world, not the borrowing of second-hand advice from business schools or bureaucracies. The development of an NGO management framework can sit confidently alongside management and organizational development theories from other sectors remain an important task for the future. In the meantime, the papers collected together in this reader give more than a glimpse of what such a framework might contain. We hope that they will help all NGO managers and staff to fulfill their potential as agents of global change and in the century to come. End of introduction.